Welcome to Teacher Talks. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer. And what's our topic today, Maria?
Today we're going to talk about comorbidities or underlying conditions. We have found that so many of these kids who have transgender self-identifications have underlying issues. They have pre-existing diagnoses, or if they don't have a diagnosis, they exhibit many behaviors that would indicate that maybe they need a diagnosis. We see autism, that's hugely overrepresented in the transgender identified population. Trauma, self-harm, depression, anxiety, so many of these underlying conditions. And I hear from parents all the time, even if their child was already being treated by a therapist or by a counselor for an underlying condition, as soon as transgender ideology or transgender identification comes up, that's all the therapist will talk about. They will not even continue dealing with any of the other issues.
And I think that there's two important things to keep in mind. One is that some of these kids, their gender dysphoria is a direct result of an underlying issue. That issue is causing self-hatred, causing them to be very uncomfortable with who they are, causing them to want to dissociate, basically causing them to want to become a different person, kill off who they are and become a different person. And then we have issues where when somebody has adopted a transgender ideology, we're seeing an increase in depression and anxiety and eating disorders, all of these things that supposedly were supposed to be cured when they transitioned. And I think that's part of the crux of the problem, is that these children who are struggling, as you said, that many of them have autism, some of them have processing disorders, underlying trauma, all kinds of underlying issues that they're dealing with. They're being told, you're going to feel all better if you transition because you were born in the wrong body. They get super excited by that because they want to get out of that pain, in the same way that somebody will embrace drugs or alcohol if they're really struggling with a lot of psychic pain. And so they feel very excited and they embrace this identity and maybe start puberty blockers, and it doesn't really cure them. So then they think, well, it's because I didn't take the hormones. So they start taking the hormones, and that doesn't really cure it. So then they get the surgeries, and that doesn't cure it. And then they realize that they've exacerbated all of the issues they already had, added new things on top of it, and that they really aren't born in the wrong body. And this is when we see suicidality go up, because they've exhausted all of the ways in which they can transition. And this is something I see in groups for people who've transitioned all the time, is they say, I did all these things, but I still have this horrible gender dysphoria. What's going on? Oh, it must be society's fault. And that's sort of the default at the end, is it must be society's fault, rather than, no, it's because you haven't addressed those underlying issues.
Yeah, the suicidality issue alone is so problematic. I've talked to therapists who've said, oh, well, this population is so depressed and there's such a higher rate of suicide. And then they make that cognitive leap to, oh, it's because society is so bad to them, or, oh, it's because they haven't transitioned or they're not accepted or whatever. And I asked one social worker, I said, well, what if the reason that there's so much depression and suicidality is because they're engaged in behaviors and activities which are harmful to them? And she really just got a glazed look in her eyes, like that had never occurred to her before. And that really should be the first thing we are asking before we ever start applying drugs and surgeries to anyone is, are there other conditions that can be dealt with in a non-surgical, non-medical way first to make this person healthy?
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of, a doctor who a patient comes in and they've been eviscerated and they've got, intestines hanging out, and their ribs are broken and their hips are broken and they're, clearly in medical need. And the doctor says something like, well, they need to eat an apple every day. I mean, that's kind of what send them out with an apple, they'll be fine. It's completely ignoring these profound underlying issues. every single detransitioner that I've heard, that I've talked to, that I've engaged with, has talked about really significant underlying issues. And the fact that we're willing to just completely gloss those over and tell them to go down a pathway, which is encouraging them to disassociate, telling them that there's no way that they can live with themselves and they have to become somebody else in order to continue to survive. It's such a horrible disservice to these people.
It is, and I think we're going to do some individual episodes of Teacher Talks where we talk about specific underlying conditions and how those can lend themselves to believing that you might be transgender. But it is important, especially for teachers, as you're encountering kids in the classroom. A lot of people in the culture, a lot of doctors, therapists, counselors, their go-to is trans. Anything's wrong with you, it must be trans. And we really need to start looking deeper than that to really protect and help kids.